The whiskey industry's purpose is to produce the cheapest litre of alcohol possible. That's what they're set up to do. And they do it very, very well. Years of research, they are very good at it. Now, I don't have an issue with that per se, but what I'm interested in is natural flavours of whiskey. We have the most flavoursome grain, after all. So my take on it is I want to make the most naturally flavoursome litre of alcohol possible. I don't care about the cost.
I'm Jeff. I retired from the military, sold everything I own, and now I'm traveling around the world to learn from brewers, winemakers, distillers, and tell their story. This is my journey of beer, wine, and spirits.
We've distilled, I think it's now 110 different farms. We do 35 a year. You need to have the ability to malt it, but before that, you need to have the ability to store it. Because if you think about it, harvest, even with different terroirs, you've got a 3 or 4 week window when the barley ripens optimally. And you've got to be able to store it separately for verification. Our logistics hinges around what we call the cathedral. Which is divided into 35 bins that contain 130 tons of green barley. That's barley harvested off the field. You can't use it like that. It has to be dried to remove the natural humidity, to take it down to about 14% humidity. Otherwise, it will rot.
So Neil, we're here at the cathedral, man, and I'm going to tell you, I am super impressed. Once I got here, it was absolutely amazing to see the separation of farms. So it's got to be a logistical nightmare though, or at least the logistics is a lot tougher than the conventional way of doing this. Talk to me about the barley from the farm getting here to the cathedral.
Typically what happens at harvest time, you have a hive of activity out here. There's farmers come from all over the region, dumping their grain into a facility like this. That barley then is dried in batches and is dumped into a warehouse. What happens here is that each single farm is brought into the warehouse, it's dried through the Alvin Blanche dryer behind us, and then it's sent in here through the conveyor system and dried to 15 degrees, and it's stored in each individual bay.
Yeah, and then when it's time for you guys to go ahead and make whiskey, talk to me a little bit.
Yeah, so it stays in here. Basically the barley goes asleep here. It's done its work out in the field, it comes here, it goes asleep for a period of time. Typically around 3 to 6 months the barley returns from dormancy. So typically, if I was calling this batch next week, so Andrew MacDonald, the guys at Dalton's here would take the batch out here, they would remove these segments of blocks, they take them out of here, they load up the trailers, 4 trailers go to Minch Malt, goes through the malting process, steeping, germination, kilning, and after about 5 days then it's transported to the Waterford Distillery. So I would call a batch roughly 3 or 4 weeks before I actually need it from here. So as I'm brewing at the distillery, there's always 2 or 3 batches in the background, either getting malted or en route from here to the maltings.
Neil, for me, this is an exciting time because I get to see the first delivery of the heritage variety come in, Old Irish.
This particular batch of Old Irish, the guys up Minch Malt could have run into issues with it because it's an unknown to these guys as well. They would have had to increase the steeping times, adjusted the germination times and kilning times. So they did their best with it because it's a new variety for them as well. The sort of analysis has come with this batch now today, and looking at it, it's going to be tricky. Things that stand out to me is the friability of it is only at 41%. We'd normally be accepting it at 93, 94%, anything above. So also I noticed that it's 50% under modified. So it's struggled through the malting process for a variety of reasons. Visually you look at it, this is a modern variety, just as a demonstration. That's a modern variety, Laureate, versus the Old Irish that came in today. You can see that the Old Irish is a lot darker in colour, but a lot smaller in size, where the modern variety is more plump. There's more starch in there, whereas this one visibly is unmodified. You can see, look, it's even very hard to break. Look, it's not even breaking for me. So that, I'm going to have milling issues with it. I'm going to have filterability issues with it. The beated Lucan is up to 911 milligrams per litre. I have never seen results that high. But look, it is what it is. It's Old Irish, it's over 130 years old. It's a new variety that we're looking to see what flavours come out of it. For me, over the next few days, it's just getting it through the brewing process, so we have wort for fermentation, and we'll see what flavours come from it. Grain silos are up the back of the yard, so we bring in our batch into one silo. I'll bring a batch of 8 to 9 tonne over here, and then we do, using our hydro wet mill, we do infusion mashing, anaerobic milling, so your grain is mixed with water, so to minimise the dust. You go through a rotary valve here, and then you have the disc mill here. So basically here is chopping up the grain, exposing those starches and enzymes needed for the mashing.
This is interesting to me, Neil, because do you guys have to change any settings from farm to farm? And then we're talking about new heirloom varietals. And did you have to change settings on that?
We do. So because we do single farm batches, so we take in 75 tonne for every single farm we do. We would do approximately 35 single farms every year. So that breaks down to, so if I bring in a single farm this week, I will do 8 brews over a course of a week. So every second day I'll do 2 brews through the hydro wet mill, and I would, for particularly the first and second brew of every single farm, I would have to focus in a lot on the set points of the mill. So what you do is you get your sort of analysis, you check the friability, you check the other parameters on that particular batch. Over a period of time I would have a fair idea what the mill gap should be set at and what the temperatures in your mash tun should be for that infusion temperature mashing. In a sense, every single farm is different. Okay, we basically babysit this batch through the process. So you look at the specification of the barley, we know it's going to be difficult to work with. Like for example, the friability is at 49.8%. We require a minimum of 93% friability. So basically it's like malting stones. That's what it's like. So you have to treat it with respect, you have to be all over, constantly taking samples, constantly minding the mill to make sure it's milling the grain consistently. We have an old variety on our hands here, treat it with respect, mind it through the process. Once we get it through the milling and mashing process, then it needs to flow through our Euro mash filter. So getting the correct temperatures in the infusion mashing is critical here. So you need good filterability of it. So again, it's constantly taking samples. Once it goes through the filtration process then and you have that sugary wort that's needed for fermentation, you've got over the first hurdle. Now you have a substance, you have a sugary mash, hopefully full of flavour. At the end of the day, if it fails here, it's 5 years down the drain because we only grow one batch of it a year. So it's a lot of people's efforts, a collaboration through a lot of people. Like, as I said, we went to the Department of Agriculture to source the seeds with partnership with our maltster, who has taken on the responsibility of both growing this batch on their own land and looking after malting of it. And then it comes to me after year 5, and all the pressure then is on ourselves here then to make sure that this goes through it. We've started up. It's over to you now. You're looking after this one.
Oh yeah, all right.
So if it goes wrong,
it's mine.
You fucked it up.
That's classic.
So we need to now make sure that we look after those flavours or get the best of those flavours from each of the single farm batches. So how we do that with fermentation is that we do a long and slow fermentation. So that ensures we liberate those flavours even further from each single farm. That's where we get the differences in flavour. And we do a long and slow fermentation through a thermoregulated fermentation. So what that means is that we have full cooling jackets on our fermentation vessels, which allows us to hold fermentation at a certain temperature
for a long period of time. So standard in the industry will be 60, 70 hours, produce alcohol, and you distill it. Because we want to focus on the barley flavour from a single farm, we purposely leave that fermentation 50, 60 hours longer. So minimum 120 hours. So anything from 120 to 160, 70 hours is where our fermentation sits. So as we send different chargers, separate chargers up to the wash still. So that gives the barley the best chance of, I suppose, when we say of unique flavour for that particular farm through that type of fermentation. It's a secondary fermentation is the important part of this long fermentation. It's a malolactic fermentation where you wait for the pH to drop and it promotes a more floral, fruity style of wash when it goes to distillation. It's important that the secondary fermentation happens after the primary fermentation, and it all doesn't happen together. So you have to do your primary fermentation, which is producing those alcohols, and then the secondary fermentation takes place secondary to the primary fermentation. That's the critical piece.
Some people are probably watching this thinking, with the different farms, are you using, different yeasts, different mashing temperatures, different, you pretty much have a standardized process.
Yeah, near enough. So every single farm is a little bit different. Obviously you have to look at each farm differently because obviously the barley is grown under different conditions, under different terroirs. So I may have to tweak the process accordingly for each single farm. Whether that's down to adjusting the mill gap, different temperatures during the infusion, temperature mashing. I standardise the length of fermentation to 120 minimum hours to 150, 60 hours. Okay, so that's standardised from every farm. Now our pitching rates, we use a standard compressed yeast. So obviously yeast produces alcohol and also puts its own fingerprint on a certain style or flavour of the spirits. We standardise yeast pitching, so we use 12 kgs for every tonne of malt we use, and we use the same compressed yeast for every single run, and it's 12 kgs for every tonne. Yeast doesn't play a bigger part in the flavour. Obviously you'll have its own, the esters will be during fermentation, but we let the barley do the talking. So we just standardise yeast pitching.
You're working with these new heirloom varieties, and again, we go back to, watching it for the first run. What did you see do differently with these new heirlooms, from fermentation? Was there anything that jumped out at you?
Because we do that long secondary fermentation, you do run the risk of maybe taking up some off flavours during the fermentation process. So that was a consideration I needed to look at, particularly for the very first heritage varieties we brought in there. So particular attention focusing on the quality of the wash at the end of fermentation for those particular ones. We've started a heirloom project 6 years ago, and we're now in our 3rd year of brewing, fermenting and distilling using heirloom varieties. And luckily enough, they seem to react well with the long and slow fermentation. It is giving that barley a better chance for flavour development and aroma development. So it's been good so far. So I haven't had to shorten the fermentations. We keep a close eye on it, and to date it's been positive. The flavours have really become very dominant through the way we ferment with the heirloom varieties.
Again, you guys are in Ireland, but you guys do not follow the Irish way of making whiskey, rightfully so. Talk to me about your distillation process, and really interested in the cut points and yield that you guys were getting from the heirloom varieties.
Because we're doing the heirloom varieties, we're not overly interested in spirit yield or volume to it. It's really about the flavour that comes from using those type of varieties. So we do a double distillation process here using our copper pot stills. The way we distill gives us a specific style of new make spirit, which further enhances the flavours from the barley, from the terroir that it comes from. So we do a very, very slow distillation, low and slow distillation. So what that means is we don't put as much steam on the spirit distillation particularly, and that ensures that the flavours are promoted more and you capture more flavours in that cut, that heart's cut. The distiller determines the cuts on every distillation, so he or she goes down, noses tasted, cuts from heads to hearts, and again for when you're making the tails cut. It's hands-on. The distillers are aware of what we're looking for, the style of spirit we're looking for, and they're qualified sensory analysts as well, so look, they're qualified to make these cuts to the way particularly Ned wants the style of spirit. Because we do that low and slow distillation, it gets more copper content, vapours, more copper contact. There's like a reflux effect during the spirit distillation where that vapours are clinging onto that copper a little bit more longer. And then before it goes into the condenser to condense back into a spirit, then is where we do sensory nods, then our heart spirit that we collect as well. So from each single farm we would probably get approximately about 40,000 litres for every 75 tonne of malt we use. For organic and biodynamically grown barley, it'll be a little bit less. For the heirloom varieties, it's an awful lot less. But it's just about flavour for those particular ones, what flavours come from the different types of farming, using different types of varieties. And in our case, what we're looking at today is looking at them old varieties to see what flavours come from them.
And then it's ready to go over maturation. And talk to me a little bit about you and Ned's relationship. Is he always coming over and checking the distillate with you?
Ned is very hands-on, obviously, from the spirit side. So Ned is the head distiller. Lovely selection of whiskies are behind me and the ones in front of us. So Ned puts these together. So every single farm we treat the very same in regards to the quality of the spirit through the farming techniques, through malting, through brewing principles, fermentation, distillation. So the process and understanding that goes behind the production of our single farm batches is second to none, right? So our understanding. So myself and Ned, both of us are looking for quality over quantity. So we're aligned there. We want to make a premium single malt whiskey. We stick to our guns and we do everything accordingly, like our traceability is second to none, to prove to the consumer that we can stand over the provenance of the barley in our production here at Waterford.
How do you complement the barley flavors with maturation?
We buy exceptionally good casks. So we would spend 30% of our overall budget, which is only second to barley, on good casks. Boy, people say, 60 or 70 or 80% of the flavour comes from casks. We wouldn't necessarily agree with that. We've done trials where we have neutral alcohol and water in the casks. It's not nice. And the reason we buy those types of casks is because of the micro-oxygenation that's required. We buy casks that are not tired casks. In Ireland, the legislation says it has to be matured in casks such as oak. Yeah. In Scotland it's oak, in Ireland it doesn't have to be oak. Yeah. But the majority of casks that are used are ex-bourbon casks. So each farm goes into roughly the same percentage, 50% American first fill, 20% American virgin, 15% French wine casks, and 15% what we call VDN or Vin de Natural casks. The main reason we have the different colour or the different casks as well, one of the main reasons is we're not using caramel, the E150. So we're depending on colour from the American virgin cask. You're not allowed to add caramel for sweetness, but it does give sweetness. So that's why we have these VDN casks. When you talk about PX or Oloroso or Port, we get those types of casks, also Riefstal, Sauternes, Marsalas, but they're genuine old casks. They're not your seasoned sherry casks, which can be an American virgin cask with a bit of sherry in it. Right. These are 20 or 30 years old, so the wood itself is tired, it's not going to give you a lot. But what the wood has a lot of sweetness in it, so we can extract the sweetness. And with the French cask, we buy really good casks. We buy from good chateaus like Mouton Roche, Chateau Lafite, Margaux, Lichbage, Pomerol, casks like that. But we're not buying it because of the wine. People think we buy it because of the wine, and it's the reason we buy it is because they buy the very, very best casks first day. So from the Limousin or Loge forests with really good grains, tight grains, they'll use it once or twice. So the wood has a lot to give us. When we get the casks in, we get those French casks in unsulfured. We will actually steam clean them then to make sure that they're clean, and then we'll fill them. So it's actually the wood we're after. It's that the properties of the wood, is the lignans and tannins that we're looking for to extract. It's not because of the wine. So for us, the way I would look at it, each farm has a different starting point, flavour-wise. Different flavours from the different terroirs, from the different soils, and that's a different starting point. The way the farmer looks after the barley, the way Neil does the brewing, the way we do the distillations, everything is given the best chance. We buy the best casks then to give it the best chance. We'll be going out to Ballygarn, we'll see we're about half a mile from the sea. So we're looking for some marine influence as well with that. So that's another aspect as well. As a cask will breed out, it'll breed in. So that's what I'm talking about, the micro-oxygenation. We're looking for the maturing of that. And the other thing then is, we don't finish. Okay, so you mentioned at the start there, you know, on a cask, on a bottle, they'll have, you know, PX finished and stuff. We start. It goes into the cask at the start. It's left there. And yeah, it might get too woody. Yeah. You know, but the way I look at it, each cask is an ingredient.
Once you guys are ready to bottle, you know, the next farm or the next year's, you know, Arcadian series, for example, walk me through the process of marrying the barrels, blending.
It starts practically, I suppose.
Yeah.
So the first thing is I'll ask the question, how many bottles do we want? So, you know, they'll say maybe 10,000 bottles. If it's for 70 centilitre bottles, I know I need 7,000 litres plus a little bit more. So I'll know how many litres I want then. Then I'll see how old it wants to be or has to be. If it's, say, a single farm or biodynamic or organic, I'd say, listen, 2018 now is 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 years old, whatever it is. If it's for the cuvee, maybe next year the cuvee will be, the youngest will be a 6-year-old whiskey. I'll know then how many farms I can work with. What I do is I get a lot of samples then, or email the guys here and say, I need samples of these, get the samples, and then it's measuring. The way I work with it, I know that my American first fill cask is kind of my layer, base layer, my digestive in a cheesecake kind of situation.
Yeah.
So I know roughly I'm going to start with maybe somewhere between 30 and 50% of that. So I'll start somewhere, then I'll add the American New, VDN and the French, and yeah, I'll adjust then on taste and nose, and I'll water down. That could take a week or 10 days from when I start just to get an idea.
Yeah.
And then it's to leave it for a little bit of time and see how that goes. Very rarely you get it in the first go. It could take 8 or 10 attempts, or on several occasions I had to scrap it and go back and start again. And what you do then is, once you have something that I think works or I like, is to scale it up.
There is another way of looking at it, if you're interested. And I've said this all along, Waterford is for curious people. If you are interested in knowing where real flavour, natural flavour comes from, well, great. We'll come and we'll share and show you. If you don't really want to know, and just fine. 99% of whiskey out there, that's fine. So I know what we are talking about is not everyone's cup of tea. Not everybody shares our enthusiasm for these things.